This is the Wabank Area Public Library's Lunch and Learn.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out to listen to what I have to say today. It's a big crowd, so I'm a little bit humbled here to see all of you here. I'm excited today because I get to talk about a few of my favorite things in the world. I love talking about the Civil War, certainly, no matter what the subtopic might be. There's so much to talk about with the Civil War. And I love talking about Wisconsin, and Wisconsin men and women, and boys and girls applying their trade and doing whatever they do and doing it well, certainly. But today I'm excited because the subject at hand is Wisconsinites and a few Hoosiers and later a few Wolverines who would collectively earn a moniker that would stand for all time, the Iron Brigade. Noted for its discipline on the training ground and on the battlefield as well as a unique uniform appearance. The Iron Brigade would go on to suffer the highest percentage of casualties of any Union brigade during the Civil War. And that is certainly saying something, because our Civil War saw so many young men die. My name is Eric Schlehlein, and I come to you from Heartland, a small town in northwestern Waukesha County, where I've made a home and a life for the last 25 years. I was born in Brookfield and raised in Waukesha, and so I've called Wisconsin home my entire life. I'm a writer, historian, and I'm passionate about all things Americana, especially those things that are close to home. I earn a living through service to my community as a lieutenant on the Heartland Fire Department, where I've been now for the last 16 years. And I've also been known to deliver a hot and tasty pizza for a fair price and a reasonable profit. Black Iron Mercy is my novel, and it is a novel of the American Civil War, and I am the author. It follows the story of one fictional man through a lifetime on the Wisconsin frontier and beyond, first in the lead mining town of Mineral Point, Wisconsin, and then in service to his country through Company K of the 6th Wisconsin Regiment of the noted Iron Brigade. Every soldier who wears the blue suit of the Union Army in my novel, with the exception of my main character and one other, who I used to convey a story without altering the history of a real person. But everybody else who wears that uniform was a real person. So when one is using real people in fiction, you owe it to them to get it right. So I got it right. 10 months of research using 23 different resources culminated in the novel, and I can say that its attention to detail and historical accuracy is why I'm allowed to speak to groups like this today. I'm currently on a 50-plus city tour of Wisconsin, speaking on the Iron Brigade, giving this presentation that you're going to see here. And my tour is sponsored by a company in Heartland called Emergency Disaster Recovery. And they deal with fire and water damage. And I have some information about them on the back table. I'd be happy if you take a look at them because they're making this tour a lot easier on my wallet, if you will. When President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers following the fall of Fort Sumter in April of 1861, Wisconsin, like a lot of other states, responded. Companies of roughly 100 men each were formed in small towns and big cities alike throughout the nation, throughout our state. And these companies were then banded together in groups of 10 to form 1,000-man regiments. And then 4 regiments would become a brigade. So you have a company of 100 men, a regiment of 1,000 men, and a brigade 4,000 men. And that's simplified a little bit, but that's how Civil War units worked for the most part. The Iron Brigade would consist of the 2nd Wisconsin Regiment, the 6th Wisconsin Regiment, the 7th Wisconsin Regiment, and the 19th Indiana. But I'm already a little bit ahead of the game here, as those regiments wouldn't be banded together until after the 2nd Wisconsin had already experienced defeat with the rest of the Union Army at a place called Bull Run in Virginia in July of '61. The 2nd Wisconsin Regiment had left for the war before the 6th and 7th regiments were even formed. and the second was filled to the brim with 1,000 strong souls from La Crosse and Janesville, Portage and Milwaukee. They came from Dodge and Grant counties and from Racine and Oshkosh, and they represented a hodgepodge of cultures, ancestries, religions, and occupations. When they departed Madison for the East, Governor Randall sent them off with a wordy flourish, saying, quote, "It remains to give you a parting word as you go forth on your great mission. By the shedding of blood, atonement has always been made for great sins. This rebellion must be put down in blood, and treason punished by blood. You go forth not on any holiday errand, not on any 4th of July excursion, but as men to perform great and urgent duties." The 2nd Wisconsin would see their first action a few weeks later when a general named William Tecumseh Sherman would order them up. Is it that mic that I'm freaking out on? Okay. Sherman would order them up Henry House Hill amidst a hail of buck and ball and artillery bursts, caught up in what one soldier would call the work of death and carnage. For the first time, the boys of the 2nd would encounter the Confederates under a general, a West Pointer named Thomas J. Jackson, who, on this day, would earn himself a new nickname, Stonewall. It would not be the last time that these men would see each other on the battlefield. It would not go well that day for the 2nd, nor for the rest of the Union Army. This Battle of Bull Run would end in humiliation for the Northerners, with the survivors scampering back to Washington as fast as they could. An embarrassed Private Henry Allen of the 2nd would write in his journal, quote, "The retreat was one of the most ignominious that ever happened to American soldiers, and I hope that it will never occur again. The road for miles was strewn with artillery, muskets, and the implements of war, also a great deal of ammunition, shovels, muskets, baggage wagons loaded with provisions and clothing estimated about 250,000, all of which fell into the rebels' hands." For the 2nd Wisconsin, General Sherman would submit the regiment's official loss as 23 killed, 65 wounded, and 23 missing and presumed prisoners. This is Thomas S. Allen of the 2nd Wisconsin Regiment. Mr. Allen was a native of New York who moved to Dodgeville in 1847. He was a printer, a mine surveyor, a school teacher, and clerk of the Dodge County Board. He was living in Mineral Point when the war started and was soon commissioned a major in the 2nd Wisconsin. He would be wounded at Antietam in 1862, wounded again at Rappahannock Station a year later, and would later serve as Wisconsin's Secretary of State under his old commander, Governor Lucius Fairchild. He would die in 1905 in Winnebago, Wisconsin, at the age of 80. You sure can. Private Frederick Lightson, Company G of the 2nd Wisconsin. Here he is sporting the Wisconsin militia gray frock coat and tall shako used by the 2nd Wisconsin early in the war. Frederick would be wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, and he would transfer to the Veteran Reserve Corps a year later. Two weeks before the Battle of Bull Run, the 6th Wisconsin was formed at Camp Randall in Madison. And companies from Fond du Lac and Beloit, Prairie du Chien and Milwaukee were among them. Boys from the counties of Juneau, Dane, Sauk, Pierce, Buffalo, and Crawford would forever be cemented into history with one another, sharing a common bond that would last the rest of their lives. Company K of the 6th, formed in Mauston, is the company in which my fictional protagonist in Black Iron Mercy is found. Company K left Mauston in July of 1861 with 94 strong souls, including this 18-year-old man, Private James P. Mickey Sullivan. Mickey was the inspiration behind my novel, and it is to him whom I dedicated my novel. Mickey would be wounded at South Mountain, again at Gettysburg, and then again at the Battle of Weldon Railroad. Mickey would spend his later years advocating for his brethren in veterans' rights and recognition, always fighting for history to get the story straight. He earned a living after the war by farming a tough piece of land in Vernon County near Hillsborough, and he would eventually pass the bar and practice law. Mickey would die in Ontario, Wisconsin in 1906 at the age of 63. The 6th Wisconsin was still at Camp Randall drilling and learning to become soldiers when the debacle happened at Bull Run. And in the aftermath of that battle, and because an attack on Washington seemed imminent, the 6th Wisconsin was hastened to Washington along with a lot of other regiments from around the country. The 6th arrived in Washington on August 7th and was assigned to Rufus King's Provisional Brigade along with the 5th Wisconsin. This association would be short-lived, however. Then the 5th would be reassigned to a brigade under Winfield Scott Hancock, ending the possibility of an all-Wisconsin brigade under King. A few days later, the 2nd Wisconsin arrived. The veterans from Bull Run. They were coming from another camp. Their marching gait was full of confidence and vigor, and the men of the 6th watched as the arriving columns arrived, awing at the torn and dirty uniforms, and the ultimate feature of envy for new troops, bullet-riddled battle flags. A short time later, the 19th Indiana arrived, led by Colonel Sullivan Meredith. Quote, "Looking up, our boys saw astride a black horse what seemed to us the tallest man we had ever seen," wrote one Wisconsin man. Colonel Meredith was 6 feet 7 inches tall. The 19th was made up of companies from the central portion of Indiana for the most part, the men being mainly from Indianapolis and the Muncie area. There's one exception, the Elkhart Lake Company came from South Bend. Major changes now occurred in the Army. Irvin McDowell, the commander of the Union forces at Bull Run, was replaced with George McClellan, who quickly cleaned house. McClellan's best quality as a general was organization, and he reorganized the Army and scourged the worst of his officers from under his command. And when he was done shifting things around, he would rename his army the Army of the Potomac. There would be no major movements or engagements for the newly formed Army of the Potomac for the rest of 1861. McClellan's efforts were concentrated on organization and drill, camp cleanliness, temperance, and the performance of the men on the parade ground. The boys from Wisconsin were instantly impressed with him. Quote, "McClellan is very active," the 2nd Wisconsin man wrote his hometown newspaper. "He's in his saddle a large portion of the time. It is said he even visits the camps in citizen's dress, so determined is he to know that everything goes right and that his soldiers are properly cared for." Such conduct on his part is certainly well calculated to win the confidence of the men. Captain Rufus Dawes of Company K of the 6th found the general, quote, "a splendid-looking man just in the prime of life, and the boys are all carried away with enthusiasm for him." On October the 7th, the expected 7th Wisconsin arrived in Washington and attached itself to King's brigade. And the boys of the 2nd and the 6th were delighted to see the familiar gray uniforms and the blue colors of the Wisconsinites. One 6th Wisconsin man remarked that it seemed kind of natural to see someone fresh from Badgerdom. Their excitement was short-lived, however, as the arrival of the 7th saw the exit of the 5th, not the 19th Indiana, as the boys had hoped. But the table was set now. The 2nd Wisconsin, the 6th Wisconsin, the 7th Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana would remain brigaded together for almost the rest of the war. Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery would be attached to them. Major Joseph B. Campbell, Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery. The major, while still a captain, would show bravery and competence in the brigade's first engagement at Brawner's Farm, at a place the boys knew as Gainesville, in the opening sequences of the Battle of 2nd Bull Run. A few short weeks later, he would be severely wounded in the neck, shoulder, and side while in command of his battery opposite the cornfield at Antietam. Captain Homer Drake, Company G of the 7th Wisconsin. Shown here before the brigade was issued the famous black hat. The captain enlisted from Simmons and was promoted to first lieutenant in May of 1862. Captain Drake would resign on February 11th of 1863 for reasons that seem to have escaped history. the campaigning season over, the Army settled into winter quarters among the muck and mud of Washington. And when spring came, General McClellan would take his time in moving on the rebels. And when finally forced to act by President Lincoln himself, he would come up with a plan to take Richmond, not by direct land assault, but rather through a complicated and convoluted water operation known as the Peninsular Campaign. King's Brigade would be left behind, however, much to the dismay of the Wisconsinites and Hoosiers. It should be noted here that at this time, King's Brigade was the only brigade in the entire Eastern Army made up completely of Western men. In 1862, the United States, with the exception of Oregon and California, didn't extend beyond Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota. So Wisconsin and Indiana were still considered to be West. Now, whether or not it had anything to do with their origins, the men of this brigade couldn't help but feel slighted being left to guard Washington with others while the rest of the Army went south to take Richmond and win the war. The brigade settled into camp life, guarding, drilling, performing all sorts of manual labor, including tree cutting, bridge building. More changes occurred in the officer ranks, with incorrigible and incompetent officers being replaced. The brigade was getting better at its trade, and people were starting to notice them on the parade ground. Then on May 8th, Rufus King was replaced with Brigadier General John Gibbon, a Pennsylvanian who had been raised in North Carolina. Gibbon had 3 brothers who went off to fight for the Confederacy. Gibbon was a West Pointer who had been in command of Battery B before its association with its current brigade. And the brigade had been drilling hard before his arrival. But now, it was reveille at 5 a.m., followed by a roll call and a review. Then they drilled by company for an hour before being served breakfast. Following the meal, there'd be a sick call, a fatigue call, followed by a guard mount where the changing of the guard would take place. Next, 2.5 hours of company or squad-sized drill, then formation, followed by dinner, followed by a half hour of free time, followed by formation again. On most days, it would now be about 1:30 in the afternoon. Now entire regiments would drill at once for the next 3 hours, practicing anything and everything military. Upon completion, they'd be dismissed by company for supper. After another break, it would be time for a dress parade. Then, tattoo would commence, meaning all noise needed to cease within 15 minutes. After another roll call, the men would go to bed, usually falling asleep within minutes. At 5 a.m., reveille, followed by a roll call and a review. The leadership and discipline offered by General Gibbon, and he wasn't alone in his competence. There were a lot of good officers and non-commissioned officers in the brigade who were responsible for the later success of the unit. Men like First Lieutenant William Sloat, a Milwaukeean in Company F of the 6th Wisconsin. Sloat was a tough disciplinarian who had a reputation for motivating everybody, whether they were in his regiment or not. Said Private William Ray, quote, "I can never forget how brave the officers were at Gettysburg, especially Lieutenant Sloat. He gave the stragglers no peace at all, kept driving them to their regiments. And those at their regiments were too far away, he put them in our regiment." Sloat resigned on September 13th of 1864 due to some severe wounds he received at the Battle of Bethesda Church. The singling out Gibbon and Sloat hardly seems fair to the rest of the officers. Men like Edward Bragg and Rufus Dawes, Solomon Meredith, Frank Haskell, dozens more. These were citizen soldiers who learned their trade at the same time as the men they were leading. The boys wanted to be in Virginia fighting with McClellan and the rest of the Army, but being in Washington during the Peninsular Campaign is, in my opinion, the single greatest reason for the later success of the brigade. Gibbon turned them into fighters who had people talking about how well-disciplined they were way before they even saw a battlefield. On the 17th day of May, just 10 days into Gibbon's command, the brigade would receive new uniforms, and within days, every soldier in Gibbon's brigade would be wearing a woolen blue shirt under a blue federal frock coat, and the item that would become their trademark, the black Hardy hat. The This is an unidentified soldier of the 6th Wisconsin Regiment wearing one variation of the black Hardy hat. He's also got a non-commissioned officer's belt on and a dress coat. The Peninsular Campaign would not end well for McClellan. After a series of hard fights known as the 7 Days Battles, the Army would need to recuperate, regroup, and McClellan would be replaced with a new commander, John Pope. Now, Gibbon's brigade would finally get their chance. This is First Lieutenant Burns Newman, Company G of the 7th Wisconsin Regiment. Newman enlisted at New Lisbon as a private, and he'd work his way up through the ranks to the rank of First Lieutenant. He was killed in action at Jericho Ford, Virginia on May 24, 1864. In late July, the Army of the Potomac would again head south. Of course, Gibbon's brigade's going to come with them this time. And they'd see their first action at Bronner's Farm in the opening sequences of the Second Battle of Bull Run, where they would meet the seasoned veterans of the Stonewall Brigade head-on. They held their own that day, the boys of the 6th trading fire with Isaac Trimble's Georgians and Alabamans for about an hour. From a letter penned on August 29th, 1862 by Lieutenant Frank Haskell of the 6th Wisconsin Regiment to his family on the morning following the brigade's inaugural battle at Bronner Farm. Quote, "None of the officers could look upon our thinned ranks, so full the night before, now so shattered, without tears. And the faces of those brave boys, as the morning sun disclosed them, no pen can describe. The men were cheerful, quiet, and orderly. The dust and blackness of battle were upon their clothes and in their hair and on their skin, but you saw none of these. You only saw their eyes and the shadows of the light of battle and the furrows plowed upon cheeks that were smooth the day before and now not half filled up. I could not look upon them without tears and could have hugged the necks of them all." Lieutenant Haskell himself would later be promoted to colonel and lead his own regiment at the Battle of Cold Harbor, Virginia, where he would be killed leading them in an assault. His body would be returned to Wisconsin. Second Bull Run ended much like First Bull Run. And Pope would be replaced by the man he replaced, General McClellan, who would get his old job back as commander of the Army of the Potomac. And when General Lee turned his army northward to invade Maryland, McClellan followed. On September 14th, 3 separate battles took place at a place called South Mountain, where possession of mountain passes with the names Crampton, Fox, and Turner were fought for. Gibbon's brigade, ordered to take the heights at Turner's Gap, moved with such discipline and precision while under fire that their commanding general, George McClellan, was moved enough to ask General Hooker, "What troops are those fighting on the pike?" Hooker replied, "General Gibbon's brigade of Western men." "They must be made of iron," said McClellan. Well, this got Hooker excited. He said, "By the eternal, they are iron. If you had seen them at Bull Run as I did, you would know them to be iron. By General Hooker, they fight equal to the best troops in the world." Now, whether or not this exchange ever really took place is in debate. But just 3 days later, the armies would meet again in the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, a place called Antietam. And by nearly all accounts, Gibbon's brigade had embraced the new nickname, Iron Brigade. Now, I'm not here to debate how the name was given or received for that matter, and such debate would be so much more important if they hadn't lived up to it down the road. But time and again, Gibbon's brigade would live up to that moniker, and then some, oftentimes holding their own against forces which would outnumber them. They would go through hell at Antietam, surging back and forth across a cornfield, time and again, and down a pike, time and again, yielding but not breaking and giving as good as they would receive. Private William P. Harrison, Company K of the 6th Wisconsin. This is not William Harrison. I already showed you Burns, didn't I? Here he is. This is my favorite photo I'm going to show you today. Harrison signed the muster at Boston. Love his hat. He He had eyes that were so blue they bordered on silver, which you can actually pick up in the photo. Harrison was shot through the spine at Antietam, and he would die at Boonesboro, Maryland 3 days later. There's a story which depicts the fog of battle and its aftermath that I'll tell now, but I always have trouble getting through it, so bear with me if I can't. It involves two prominent citizens of Fond du Lac with similar names, Edward Bragg and Edwin Brown. Edward Bragg and Edwin Brown both served with the 6th Wisconsin Regiment. One day after the Battle of Antietam, a message from a sergeant of the regiment sent via the Wisconsin State Telegraph Company reached Mrs. Bragg. Quote, "Your husband was shot yesterday. I will send him home by express." Now, word passes quickly in small towns, as I'm sure you all know here. And when it reached Ruth Brown, Edwin's wife, she rushed to be with the new widow. Plans for memorial services were made, and a delegate was sent to Chicago to bring home Bragg's body. But 4 days later, however, a new message arrived, this one coming from the delegate. Quote, "The body of Captain Edwin Brown, instead of Bragg, will be home tomorrow. Chicago Times reports Bragg wounded in the arm." 2 days later, a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Bragg arrived at the Browns' home. Quote, "He was a good soldier, a brave and chivalrous gentleman, and above all, he cherished a fond love for his home and the domesticities that this cruel war has severed. Believe me, madam, the regiment deeply mourns his loss, and his brother officers will long cherish this memory, and through me, express to you their kindest and heartfelt sympathies in your bereavement." Now, I haven't the proper permissions to show you an image of Edwin Brown, but some exist certainly. I encourage you to seek him out and lay your eyes on him at least one time. This is Colonel Edward S. Bragg, originally of Company E of the 6th Wisconsin Regiment, shown here as a brigadier general. Bragg was born in New York, where he was admitted to the bar in 1848 before coming west to practice law in Fond du Lac in 1850. Bragg, as I said, was severely wounded in the arm at Antietam, and he would be injured again at the Battle of Chancellorsville, having his foot broken by a horse. He would miss the Gettysburg campaign while convalescing. Bragg would be promoted to brigadier general in June of 1864 and would be in command of the Iron Brigade from June of 64 until February of 65, when he would be promoted again. A Democrat, Bragg would serve in Congress for 3 terms and then as ambassador to Mexico in the Cleveland administration. He would die in Fond du Lac on June 20th of 1912. Following Antietam, the Iron Brigade would be weakened enough for Gibbon to ask for an additional regiment, and soon they would receive the 24th Michigan. Mustered into service in Detroit in October of 1862, the Michigan Regiment boasted mostly Wayne County men. They arrived with a full regiment, 1,000 strong, with clean new uniforms, unsoiled flags, and a brass band. One Wisconsin officer wrote home, quote, "They're a splendid-looking body of men, entirely new to the service. Their ranks are full now, and they are, as we were, crazy to fight." The welcome was not a warm one, however. The Badgers and the Hoosiers standing off to the side a couple of 100 yards off, studying the new men. The Wolverines would eventually be accepted as full-fledged members of the Iron Brigade. But for now, well, that was a long way off. Now, they'd be known as the Big Regiment, or as the Featherbeds, because they took so long in signing up for the war. The next engagement for the Iron Brigade would be at Fredericksburg on December 13th of 1862. And the brigade would be engaged with the rebels in a position alongside the Rappahannock River in minor combat compared to the hell going on in front of Marye's Heights. After McClellan had failed to follow up on assaulting Lee after Antietam, Lincoln had replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside. Fredericksburg would be the only major engagement with Burnside in command, and it resulted in the largest defeat for the Union to date. From Black Iron Mercy on page 230, This is Sergeant Arliss Jenkins to a new recruit. February 25th of 1863. Being labeled as the Iron Brigade is a nasty, double-edged sword. Iron is just a name, nothing more. We're a disciplined, well-trained group of soldiers, but we bleed as much and as easily as anyone else. Other brigades, other corps, even civilians, thanks to the newspapers, have lofty, sometimes unrealistic expectations of this brigade. Because we're the Iron Brigade, we're expected to be tougher, stronger, and more obstinate than everyone else. We're expected to be more seasoned and hardened than everyone else. We're expected to take hailstorms of lead and not flinch, but rather to bleed and die as if it's why we joined up in the first place. We're expected to take the hill no matter the cost and then hold it till the last man. We're not allowed to retreat or break or be beaten ever or, God forbid, turn our backs to the enemy and run away. This brigade lost 1,750 men, earning the name Iron Brigade. First Lieutenant Charles Weeks, Company B of the 7th Wisconsin Regiment. Weeks enlisted at York, Wisconsin, in Dane County. And he would be wounded at Bethesda Church, Virginia in May of 1864. And he would muster out in December of that year while still convalescing from his wound. His term expired. In May of 1863, the Battle of Chancellorsville commenced, with General Lee dividing his force and sending Stonewall Jackson's corps on a flanking maneuver, destroying the right side of the Army of the Potomac, which was now under another new commander, General Joseph Hooker. When the devastation was over, Lee would have another brilliant victory. Jackson would lose his life, and the Iron Brigade would cover the retreat as the Army of the Potomac would see another new commander in General George Gordon Meade. July 1st of 1863 dawned with the Iron Brigade leading the entire army northward in pursuit of Lee's army. And they would clash at a tiny town in southern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg, where, after everything they had gone through to date, the brigade would have its finest hour at a terrible price. A cavalry general named Buford had selected a high piece of ground the day before, and the First Corps of General John Reynolds, to which the Iron Brigade belonged, was hurrying to help him hold it. On their way, the men of the Iron Brigade would pass landmarks which would forever be remembered just because they were passed by these very boys on this very day. The Scherfy farm, the Wentz house, the Rawls farm, the Snyder house, the Cadore farm. The brigade, with the exception of the 6th Wisconsin, which had been ordered to lie down in reserve, hurried over a slight rise and into the trees of the Herbst woods, disappearing into an open woodlot beyond. The 2nd Regiment, on the right side of the brigade, was the first to reach McPherson's Ridge, with General Reynolds right behind them, shouting, "Forward, men! Forward, for God's sake, and drive those fellows out of the woods!" Within moments, 1/3 of the Wisconsinites would be shot down. But they continued forward, poured volley after volley into the rebels, which were Tennesseans and Alabamans, under a general named James Archer. General Reynolds would be killed by a sharpshooter's bullet within minutes of ordering the 2nd forward. The 7th Wisconsin moved in next to the 2nd, and the 19th on their left and the 24th on the left flank. And a most desperate fight ensued, and I could spend as much time talking about this moment on the battlefield at McPherson's Ridge and along the Willoughby Run as I have on the entire history of the brigade. Scores were killed and wounded on both sides, and the men of Archer's brigade were every bit as obstinate as the men of the Iron Brigade. Patrick Private Mahoney of the 2nd Wisconsin would capture General Archer in the fight. The celebration wouldn't last, however. Private Mahoney would be killed later in the day. Meanwhile, to the right of the brigade, another brigade, this one under just General Lysander Cutler, was being driven backward with many of those soldiers in full flight. General Doubleday, who was now in command after the death of Reynolds, ordered the 6th Wisconsin, which was still in reserve, to move northward and come to the aid of the retreating brigade. The rest of the brigade was facing west in a hot firefight, And the 6th was moving north with the rest of the brigade along to their left. When they reached Chambersburg Pike, the 6th poured a volley into the rebels that were chasing Cutler's brigade, and the rebels jumped into an unfinished railroad cut parallel to the line of the 6th. Colonel Rufus Dawes, in command of the regiment, ordered his men to charge the cut, which lay about 175 paces ahead of the regiment. They did as ordered, the color guard at the center and Dawes among them, and they faced devastating fire while crossing this open ground. "A line on the colors! Close up on the colors!" Dawes yelled repeatedly, and as the killed and wounded fell out of the line, the men would move to the center to fill in the gaps. When they reached the cut, the rate of fire increased and then died away, and then the men of the Wisconsin Regiment began pleading with the rebels, who were from the 2nd Mississippi Regiment, to lay down their weapons rather than be shot down like hogs. "Who is the colonel of this regiment?" shouted Dawes. "I am," a major answered. "Surrender," Dawes said, "or I will fire." Further to the left, a hot fight was going on for the colors of the Mississippi Regiment. Many men on both sides fell in the scrap for that flag, and it would end up in the hands of this man, Sergeant Frank Waller, Company I of the 6th Wisconsin Regiment. Born in Guernsey County, Ohio, Waller would enter service in Vernon County, Wisconsin. For his actions at Gettysburg, in capturing the colors of the 2nd Mississippi Regiment, Waller would earn himself the Medal of Honor. Long after the war, the former commander of Company I, Earl Rogers, would say this: "Waller was one of the few soldiers who at no time during the 4 years of service was absent from roll call. He stood in the ranks and fought in every battle and skirmish." That's high praise indeed. Very few men could boast such a thing, especially in the Iron Brigade, which suffered so many casualties throughout its service. Waller would serve as the Vernon County Sheriff after the war, and he would die in Retreat, Wisconsin, which is certainly an ironic name for a town for him to do so. April 30th of 1911, he would be 70 years old. The Battle of Gettysburg wasn't over, though. The following day, the survivors would be on the right flank of the Union line, and they would fight again, they would hold again, they would suffer casualties again. The Battle of Gettysburg would decimate the brigade, as well as the rest of the armies who fought there. Numbers vary, as they always do, in regard to Civil War numbers, casualties. The total casualties in the 3-day battle are estimated to be around, or well above, 50,000. For the Iron Brigade, the numbers are staggering. In the 6th Wisconsin, 420 men made the charge on the railroad cut on that first day, and only 240 of them made it to the cut. In Company K, of the 33 men who made that charge, only 8 were fit for duty after the battle. 77% of the men in the 2nd Wisconsin Regiment were on the casualty list. The 24th Michigan would lose 363 of their 496 soldiers at Gettysburg. That's 73%. For the entire brigade, roughly 1,215 of the 1,885 men who were engaged were casualties. The officers of the brigade were hit especially hard. Following the battle, Colonel Rufus Dawes, who had led the charge on that cut on the first day, was the only field officer who was fit for duty, not only in the 6th Regiment, but in the entire brigade. The brigade had again lived up to its reputation, holding its own, holding the ground on which it stood, and it had almost been annihilated in the process. The actions of this brigade on McPherson's Ridge and at the railroad cut would be overshadowed by the actions of the 20th Maine at Little Round Top the following day, and by Pickett's charge on the 3rd day of the battle. And history would forever embrace those events, putting the events of the first day on a permanent back burner. Sergeant John Mitchell of Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery. Sergeant Mitchell took command of a half battery at Gettysburg after Lieutenant James Davidson was wounded on the first day of the battle. At the Battle of Gravelly Run in March of '65, Mitchell, now a lieutenant in charge of 6 guns, would be shot in 4 places: his arm, his neck, left shoulder, and in the right side. He refused to leave his guns and fought for an additional 4 hours until a brigade surgeon warned him that remaining at his post any longer would certainly kill him. Following Gettysburg, the war would continue for almost 2 more years. And the regiments of their Iron Brigade would continue to do their duty, fighting in battle after battle, always living up to their reputation. In one form or another, their members would be at Mine Run, at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, the Siege of Petersburg, Weldon Railroad, Gravelly Run, Five Forks, and at Appomattox. One more final note now about casualties. It has long been reported that 2 of every 3 soldiers who died in the Civil War did so because of disease. 66% of the soldiers who died in the war died of disease. In a war that saw a 2-to-1 ratio, disease versus battle-related death, the 6th Wisconsin experienced 3.1 battle-related deaths for every soldier who died of disease. The 2nd Wisconsin, 3.4 battle-related deaths for every soldier who died of disease. The numbers in the 7th Wisconsin and the 19th Indiana are similar. And as for the 24th Michigan, the last regiment of the brigade to see a battlefield for the first time, the numbers still lean in the direction of battle deaths to disease deaths. That regiment saw 1.4 battle-related deaths for every soldier who died of disease. The 2nd Wisconsin would become the Wisconsin Independent Battalion on June 11th of 1864 and would serve as division provost until November 30th of that year, when its survivors merged into the 6th Wisconsin as companies G and H. The 6th and 7th Wisconsin regiments would muster out in July of 1865. The 7th Indiana Regiment would merge into the 19th Indiana Regiment in September of 64, and then the 19th Indiana would merge into the 20th Indiana and leave the Iron Brigade altogether on October 18th of that year. This is a photo of Lucius Fairchild, Edward Bragg, and John Gibbon in an 1880 photo taken at a reunion in Milwaukee where the veterans had formed an Iron Brigade Association. Fairchild here, he was the colonel of the 2nd Wisconsin Regiment. You'll notice his left sleeve is empty. He lost that arm at Gettysburg. So I have to thank a few people publicly. First of all, Mr. Lance Hertigan and Mr. Scott Hahn for allowing me to reproduce photographs that they have the rights to so that I can show them to you today. And certainly I want to thank Patsy and Peg for allowing me to speak to you today. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed the program.